Hey guys, tonight we ease into something that sounds lofty, ancient, and faintly intimidating, holy saints, but you're not standing in a cathedral or squinting at stained glass. You're right here, in the present moment, probably adjusting your pillow, maybe wondering if your spine has always made that noise when you turn. The air feels still, the day finally loosening its grip on you. And as we begin, you realize that the lives of saints weren't lived in marble silence, they were lived in dust. Noise, hunger, confusion, and the kind of awkward human moments that would absolutely ruin a modern group chat. Honestly, if you had been there, you probably wouldn't have survived a week. You might not even have survived the sandals. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, I'd love to know where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now, night, dawn, or that strange hour where sleep pretends it's coming but never quite shows up. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin by drifting backward, not in a dramatic time machine way, but gently, like stepping into a story already mid-sentence. The early Christian world hums around you. Roads are rough under your feet. Cities smell strongly of animals and humans doing their best. And belief is not a private opinion but a dangerous choice. You hear whispers of gatherings in homes, of symbols scratched quickly into stone, of prayers said quietly enough that the neighbors might not notice. One of the most well-known historical events floats past you here: the spread of Christianity through the Roman Empire. Slow at first, then unstoppable, like a rumor that refuses to die. You feel the tension in the air. Faith isn't fashionable yet. It's suspicious. You pass people who will later be called saints, though right now they look like tired men and women with dust on their hems and doubts in their eyes. One strange, lesser-known fact slips in quietly. Many early Christians didn't actually expect the world to last very long. Some genuinely believed the end was imminent, which explains why long-term planning wasn't exactly a priority. Why invest in real estate when eternity is scheduled for next Tuesday? Historians still debate how much this expectation shaped early saintly behavior, and how many later stories were polished to look calmer and more confident than the reality ever was. You pause near a gathering, half hidden by shadow. Someone is reading aloud, slowly, because books are rare and literacy even rarer. The words matter. You notice how physical belief is here. Faith is something you walk with, carry, sometimes literally bleed for. And yet, there's humor too. A man shifts his weight, knees aching from standing too long. A child fidgets. Sanctity, it turns out, has terrible posture. As you move through this world, names begin to surface: Peter, Paul, Stephen, but they aren't monuments yet. They're just people trying to make sense of something vast. Stephen's martyrdom, one of the most famous early events, hangs heavy in the background, stones thrown, witnesses watching, history taking notes, and yet a quieter detail often overlooked drifts by. The people throwing those stones would later remember that day very differently. Some with pride, others with a discomfort that never quite went away. Again, historians still argue about how these memories shaped later conversions. You notice how fear and routine coexist. Saints don't glow. They get hungry. They worry about money. They wonder if they said the wrong thing to the wrong person. One woman quietly wonders if holiness is supposed to feel less confusing than this. Spoiler: it doesn't. If you're expecting instant spiritual clarity, this era would disappoint you deeply, kind of like downloading a meditation app and realizing it still requires effort. As night falls, lamps flicker. You hear prayers that sound less like poetry and more like exhaustion talking to the dark. There's a sensory richness here: oil smoke, murmured Latin and Greek, the scrape of sandals. You realize something gently unsettling. Many saints didn't know they were saints. They thought they were improvising, making it up, hoping they weren't completely wrong. That's oddly comforting, like finding out even history's most revered figures were basically winging it. A small, strange detail drifts in. Some early Christians reused pagan household items for worship simply because that's what they had. Bowls, cloths, even old symbols reinterpreted overnight. Sacredness was portable. Historians still debate where adaptation ends and transformation begins. But standing here, it feels practical more than ideological. You work with what's on the table, literally. You feel the story pulling you forward without rushing. There's no sharp cut, no new chapter announcement, just a continuous thread of belief stretching, fraying, tightening again. You think, briefly, about how inconvenient all this would be with modern notifications going off every 5 minutes. Honestly, half the saints would have thrown their phones into the sea. As you settle deeper into the rhythm of this world, the noise softens, the danger remains, but it's folded into daily life now. Faith isn't a headline, it's background music. And as your breathing slows, you sense that this is only the beginning, not an introduction. Not a summary, but a quiet opening door. The saints are still walking. You're walking with them, and for now, that's enough. You don't step into a new chapter so much as drift onward. Like a thought that refuses to end neatly. The world around you hasn't changed much since the last breath you took, still Roman roads. Still the low murmur of danger, but the tension has thickened. The way air does before a storm you pretend not to notice. You can feel it now, the era of martyrs. Not the polished, candle-lit version you'll see centuries later, but the raw, uncomfortable reality of people being watched, questioned, and quietly erased. You walk past a marketplace where normal life stubbornly continues. Bread is sold. Arguments happen. Someone complains about the price of olives as if history isn't sharpening a knife nearby. This is the strange thing about persecution. One of the most well-known historical realities of early Christianity is how uneven it was. There was no constant empire-wide hunt. Some days were ordinary, some days were catastrophic, and no one ever knew which kind they were waking up to. You hear a name whispered, Ignatius, maybe, or Perpetua, figures you'll later see carved in stone. But right now they are flesh and nerves. Perpetua's imprisonment, one of the most famous martyr stories, hovers close. You feel the damp walls of a cell, the claustrophobic press of bodies, the way time stretches when you don't know how many mornings you have left. What's less often mentioned is that prisons then weren't designed for long stays. They were holding pens of neglect. Hunger and sickness did as much work as executioners ever did. Historians still debate how many martyrs died from conditions alone, rather than formal sentences. You notice something quietly unsettling. Not all martyrs are calm. Some are terrified, some beg, some hesitate at the last moment. This doesn't make it into stained glass very often. There's a persistent myth that holiness equals composure. But standing here, you can tell that courage often sounds like shaking breath held together by stubbornness. If you were here, you'd probably be calculating your odds, wondering if pretending to trip and run might work. It wouldn't, but the thought is very human. As you move closer to an execution site, not dramatically, just incidentally, as part of the city's machinery, you hear laughter. That's another detail history tends to smooth over. Crowds didn't always come for cruelty. Sometimes they came because it was something to do. Entertainment and punishment overlapped in deeply uncomfortable ways. The arena is a place you recognize from textbooks. But what you feel now is scale, the size of it. The noise, the way an individual life becomes very small very quickly. A strange, lesser-known fact drifts in softly. Some early Christians actively sought martyrdom, turning themselves in or provoking authorities. Church leaders were not always thrilled about this. There are surviving writings gently, and sometimes not so gently, telling believers to please stop getting themselves killed on purpose. Historians still argue whether these actions were expressions of faith, desperation, or a complex mix of social pressure and theology. Standing here, it mostly feels tragic and very awkward. You linger on the edge of a story about Polycarp, an elderly bishop whose death became legendary. The famous version emphasizes dignity and fire that refused to burn him. But quieter accounts mention his age, his slowness, the simple exhaustion of being very old in a very unforgiving world. Sanctity doesn't cancel arthritis. That's just biology being rude again. What surprises you most is how memory works here. Stories spread fast, but not accurately. Details blur. Names are swapped. Motives are polished. You can almost see the process happening in real time. Like a game of historical telephone. A death meant as a warning becomes a sermon. Fear is repurposed into inspiration. Historians still debate which martyr narratives are eyewitness truth and which are devotional embroidery stitched later. As night settles again, you realize martyrdom wasn't a daily goal for most believers. It was a risk, an unwanted possibility hovering at the edges of ordinary life. Most saints hoped, quite reasonably, to live quietly. They wanted to pray, eat, sleep, and not be torn apart by animals in front of strangers. A shockingly relatable ambition. You feel yourself growing calmer. Oddly enough, the stories are heavy, but the telling is gentle now. The noise fades. The crowds dissolve into shadows. What remains is the sense that holiness, at this stage, isn't about triumph, it's about endurance. And as you drift forward, breathing slower, the shadows lengthen, carrying you softly toward the quieter, lonelier places where the next saints are already walking. You don't notice the city disappearing at first. It simply thins out, like a conversation that trails off when everyone gets tired. The stone streets soften into dust, the noise into wind, and before you quite realize what's happened, you're walking toward emptiness. This is where the desert saints begin, not with drama, but with subtraction. Fewer voices, fewer walls, fewer reasons to explain yourself to anyone at all. The historical shift is familiar enough. After waves of persecution, Some Christians stop running from the world and start running away from it. You're now in the age of the desert fathers and mothers, a well-known movement where holiness relocates to places no one else wants. Egypt, Syria, wastelands where the sun feels personal and the silence presses in like a physical weight. You feel it on your skin, the dry air tightening everything, as if the world itself is asking whether you're sure about this decision. You pass a figure sitting alone, barely moving. This could be Anthony the Great, one of the most famous desert saints. Though right now he just looks like a man who forgot to stand up sometime in the last decade. His story, wealth abandoned, solitude embraced, is famous. The less talked about detail drifts in quietly. Anthony didn't always want to be alone. People kept finding him, pilgrims, admirers, people with questions. Even in the desert, fame is inconvenient. Historians still debate how much solitude these saints actually achieved versus how much was retroactively imagined. You try to imagine daily life here. There are no inspirational playlists, no scented candles, just heat, hunger, and your own thoughts, which turn out to be much louder when nothing interrupts them. One monk fights boredom by weaving baskets he doesn't need. Another memorizes entire sections of scripture simply because there's nothing else to do. This is holiness as routine, not ecstasy. More, please let today end, than transcendent glow. A strange and lesser-known fact settles beside you. Many desert saints struggled intensely with sleep. Not just insomnia, but vivid dreams, hallucinations, and what we'd now probably describe as sensory deprivation effects. Some recorded battles with demons that suspiciously resembled the human brain under stress. Historians still argue how to interpret these accounts: spiritual warfare, psychological strain, or both layered together in a way that refuses modern categories. You sit for a moment. The sand warm beneath you even as evening approaches. The silence is not peaceful at first. It buzzes. It reminds you of every awkward thing you've ever said. That's part of the point. These saints believed silence stripped you down to whatever was actually there. No distractions, no audience. If holiness existed, it had to survive boredom. And yet, humor slips in. One monk complains that his neighbor is too loud, his neighbor, who lives half a mile away and speaks to no one. Another saint becomes famous for extreme fasting, only for his disciples to quietly note that he was terrible company when hungry. Sanctity, it seems, does not improve personality nearly as much as advertised. As night falls, the desert cools fast. Stars sharpen overhead, impossibly bright. You hear chanting drift across the sand, slow and rhythmic, like breathing stretched into sound. This is prayer without decoration. No architecture, no incense, just voices and darkness. You feel the pull of it, even if part of you is thinking about how badly you'd miss coffee. One famous historical practice emerges here: spiritual counsel. People travel long distances to ask these silent saints for advice. And often, the advice is maddeningly simple. Stay where you are. Pray. Eat. Not exactly a bestseller strategy. Historians still debate whether this simplicity was profound wisdom or a practical refusal to overcomplicate survival. You realize something quietly important. The desert saints aren't escaping the world because it's evil. They're escaping noise, power, applause. They want a faith that doesn't depend on being seen, that doesn't need persecution or praise to feel real. In a strange way, it's a reaction to martyrdom itself, holiness without blood, without crowds, without an audience chewing snacks. As your breathing slows, the desert stretches endlessly ahead, but it no longer feels empty. It feels intentional, sparse, like a room cleared of furniture so you can finally lie down on the floor. And as the night deepens, you drift forward with them, wrapped in silence, toward the quieter mysteries waiting just beyond sleep. You don't leave the desert so much as carry it with you. Even as figures begin to gather again, voices returning, footsteps overlapping, the silence of the wasteland still hums faintly in your ears. Like tinnitus for the soul. This is where miracles begin to slip in, not with trumpets, but awkwardly, like guests who weren't sure they were invited. Historically, this is familiar ground. Stories of saints performing miracles spread quickly through late antiquity and the early medieval world. Healings, visions, food multiplying at inconveniently dramatic moments. These accounts become some of the most popular and enduring parts of saintly lives. But standing here, in the middle of them, you notice how uncertain everything feels. No one is entirely sure what they've just seen, least of all the saint involved. You watch a crowd gather around a man who can now walk. That's the famous version. The quieter detail, often overlooked, is what happens afterward. The healed man is expected to explain himself, to perform wellness on demand, to justify joy. Historians still debate how many miracle stories grew in the retelling, shaped by expectation as much as by event. Memory, after all, is rarely neutral. You notice that saints themselves are frequently uncomfortable with miracles. One turns away people asking for healing, insisting they should see a doctor, an idea wildly ahead of its time. And also very unpopular. Another performs what seems like a miracle and then spends days insisting it wasn't. Sanctity, it turns out, comes with terrible PR instincts. A strange and lesser-known fact drifts by softly. Some early saints believed miracles were spiritually dangerous. They worried signs and wonders distracted from humility, turning faith into spectacle. This led to saints deliberately downplaying events, sometimes refusing to record them at all. Historians still argue whether this was genuine caution or an early attempt at damage control. You move through stories that feel half solid, half dreamlike. A vision appears at night, bright, overwhelming, terrifying in its intimacy. The saint wakes shaking, unsure whether to tell anyone. These visions become famous later. But in the moment, they're disorienting. Imagine being woken at 3 a.m. by what you believe is divine instruction and still needing to fetch water the next morning. Holiness does not excuse you from chores. You notice how sleep plays tricks here. Exhaustion, fasting, and isolation blur edges. Some saints describe seeing light pour into rooms with no windows. Others hear voices that comfort or accuse. Modern readers might squint skeptically. Medieval listeners leaned in closer. Historians still debate where physiology ends and theology begins. And honestly, the line refuses to sit still. There's humor here too, quietly folded in. One saint misinterprets a vision so badly that it causes minor chaos before being gently corrected. Another spends weeks preparing for a miracle that never happens. eventually deciding the miracle was learning patience. A very spiritual way of saying, well, that was awkward. You realize that miracles aren't neat punctuation marks in these lives. They don't arrive to prove a point and then exit stage left. They interrupt routines. They complicate relationships. They attract crowds that make solitude impossible. If saints wanted peace and quiet, miracles were a terrible strategy. As evening settles, candles flicker, stories are told in low voices, embellished slightly with each telling, not maliciously, but inevitably. Humans crave meaning, and miracles provided in concentrated form. You feel the narrative thickening around you, myth beginning its slow embrace of memory. You breathe more slowly now. The miracles don't feel loud anymore. They feel like ripples fading outward. Softer and softer. Whatever really happened, vision, healing, misunderstanding, it mattered because people believed it mattered. And belief, you realize, has weight. As your thoughts drift, the stories blur gently at the edges, carrying you forward, unhurried, into the next stretch of the night. You don't hear them announced. The women enter the story the way they entered history, quietly. Often sideways, slipping past expectations that were never built with them in mind. The world around you still hums with prayer, rumor, and candle smoke, but something shifts in tone. Authority feels less obvious here. Holiness, less officially sanctioned. This is the point where familiar names surface: Agnes, Cecilia, Perpetua again, now reframed, but the pattern is broader than any single figure. One of the most well-known historical realities is that women were central to early Christian communities, especially before institutional structures hardened. They hosted gatherings, funded movements, and in some cases led them. Later history would remember their devotion more comfortably than their influence. You walk beside a young woman facing martyrdom, her story polished smooth by centuries of retelling. The famous version emphasizes purity and courage. The quieter, stranger detail slips in. She negotiates. She reasons. She pushes back against authority in ways that are startlingly modern. Historians still debate how much of this assertiveness is original and how much was reshaped to inspire obedience later on. Standing here, it feels undeniably real. You pass households run almost entirely by women, widows, consecrated virgins, mothers whose faith quietly rearranges daily life. These women don't preach publicly, but they shape belief through routine, meals shared, children taught, stories repeated until they stick. It's not dramatic holiness, it's domestic, and it lasts. A strange and lesser-known fact drifts gently through. Some early Christian women used fasting and ascetic practices strategically, as a way to resist marriage or control their own bodies in a society that rarely offered them choices. Holiness becomes leverage. Historians still argue whether this was liberation disguised as piety or piety repurposed as survival. Possibly both, depending on the day. You notice tension everywhere. Church leaders admire female devotion but feel uneasy about female autonomy. Praise and restriction arrive together, like a gift wrapped with conditions. Some women are elevated as symbols. Others quietly sidelined once their usefulness fades. Sanctity, it seems, does not guarantee comfort. There's humor here too. If you look closely, one woman becomes famous for her extreme modesty. then spends years being followed by crowds she absolutely did not want. Another attempts to disguise herself as a man to join a monastery and is later revered for it. Though no one quite knows what to do with that detail. Historians still debate how to categorize such lives without flattening them. As night deepens, you sense a layered silence. These women prayed in rooms not designed to echo. Their voices didn't fill cathedrals. And yet, their stories endured, passed along carefully, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes rewritten to fit safer molds. You can almost hear the edits happening. You feel the rhythm slowing now. Breathing deepens. The stories don't demand admiration, they invite attention. These saints defied heaven not by shouting at it, but by quietly refusing the roles handed to them. And as you drift onward, wrapped in that gentle defiance, the candlelight dims, and the path continues, soft, unbroken, carrying you toward the next lives waiting in the dark. You don't trip over the bones at first. They're too small, too ordinary for that. They sit wrapped in cloth, tucked into boxes, sealed behind stone, handled with a care that feels almost disproportionate to their size. This is the world of relics, where belief learns to touch things, and memory decides it needs proof you can carry. Historically, this is familiar territory. By late antiquity, relics have become central to Christian devotion. Bones of martyrs, pieces of clothing, drops of blood said to have soaked into earth long ago. Churches rise around them. Pilgrims travel absurd distances for a glimpse. You recognize the big picture easily enough. What's harder to grasp is how informal it all began. You watch a small community gather around what they believe is the burial place of a martyr. No marble yet, no gold, just a sense that something important happened here, and that the ground remembers. One well-known historical practice emerges, celebrating the Eucharist directly over graves. Worship literally rests on death. The quieter details slips in. Sometimes communities argued fiercely over whose bones they actually were. Historians still debate how many relics were accurately identified versus sincerely misremembered. You notice how quickly devotion turns practical. A fragment of bone is divided, then divided again. Suddenly the same saint appears to be buried in 6 places at once. Medieval math will not help you here. A strange and lesser-known fact drifts in softly. Some early church leaders openly worried about relic fraud, warning believers not to mistake enthusiasm for authenticity. This concern, of course, did very little to slow things down. You pass a reliquary, ornate, heavy, glittering. Inside rests something profoundly unimpressive to look at. That's part of the tension. The container screams importance, the contents whisper mortality. Sanctity here is not about aesthetics. It's about proximity, touching what touched holiness, standing where faith once stood still long enough to die. There's humor tucked into this world, too. One saint becomes associated with so many relics that later commentators quietly wonder how he managed to possess multiple skulls. Another relic is famous for healing headaches, which feels suspiciously convenient. Historians still debate whether these associations emerged from experience, coincidence, or extremely optimistic interpretation. You sense the psychological comfort relics provide. In a world where illness is common and explanations scarce, tangible holiness feels reassuring. Bones don't argue theology. cloth doesn't demand understanding. You can kneel, you can touch, you can hope. For many, that's enough. And yet, controversy hums beneath the surface. Some believers recoil at the idea of venerating remains, worrying it edges too close to superstition. Others insist relics honor God's work through human bodies. The debate never quite resolves. Historians still argue where reverence ends and ritual excess begins. In standing here, you can feel both sides tugging gently at the same belief. As night settles again, candles flicker against stone. The bones rest quietly, indifferent to the attention. You breathe slower now, thoughts softening. Whatever these relics truly are, authentic fragments or mistaken memories, they function as anchors. They keep stories from drifting too far into abstraction. And as you move on, the reliquaries fade into shadow, their quiet weight lingering just enough to remind you that holiness, once embodied, leaves traces, even if we're never entirely sure whose they were. You begin to notice a pattern that's oddly consistent. The more someone insists they don't want attention, the faster attention finds them. This is where the saints who hated being saints quietly take over the story, tugging their hoods lower, hoping no one recognizes them, and failing almost immediately. Historically, this tension is well documented. Many saints explicitly resisted veneration, fame, or leadership. Some ran from it, some hid, some complied with visible irritation. The well-known event here is the reluctant elevation of holy figures into positions of authority, bishops chosen against their will, abbots dragged from solitude by enthusiastic crowds. What's less often emphasized is how exhausting this attention actually was. You walk alongside a man who pretends to be simple-minded so people will leave him alone. It almost works. This practice, sometimes called holy foolishness, becomes especially prominent in Eastern Christian traditions. A strange and lesser-known fact slips in. Some saints deliberately behaved erratically, not out of madness, but as a strategy to avoid praise. Historians still debate where performance ends and genuine psychological strain begins. You watch as admirers gather anyway. They always do. Someone asks for advice, then another, then a line forms. The saint sighs, quietly, but deeply. This isn't in the official biographies, but you can feel it. Sanctity, it seems, is terrible at respecting boundaries. There's a familiar story here. A man chosen as bishop is found hiding in a stable, hoping the smell will disqualify him. It doesn't. The crowd drags him out anyway. This is a well-known trope in saintly literature. The quieter detail is how often these reluctant leaders later struggle with administration, politics, and conflict resolution. Prayer does not automatically make you good at meetings. Humor surfaces gently. One saint becomes famous for refusing to speak, which only increases curiosity about what he might say. Another locks himself in a cell to avoid visitors, prompting people to knock louder. If you're hoping for peace and quiet, sainthood is a truly unfortunate career path. You sense the underlying anxiety here. Fame feels spiritually dangerous. Attention distorts intention. Saints worry they'll start performing holiness instead of living it. A strange, lesser-known concern drifts through. Some saints feared miracles precisely because they attracted crowds. Historians still debate how much of this fear was theological and how much was social exhaustion. As the night deepens, the stories soften. You feel sympathy for these figures. Trapped between devotion and visibility. They wanted God, not an audience, but history rarely grants anonymity to the sincere. Your breathing slows. The noise of admiration fades into a low hum. You drift onward with them, sensing that the path ahead leads into deeper interiors, visions, doubts, habits stranger still, where even saints cannot quite escape themselves. You don't fall asleep here. You hover in that uncertain space just before it, where thoughts loosen their grip and images start arriving uninvited. This is the territory of visions. And it feels immediately different, less solid, more luminous, like the world has been gently overexposed. Historically, visions are everywhere in the lives of saints. Angels appear, Christ speaks, heaven opens briefly, then closes again without explanation. These accounts become some of the most quoted and revered episodes in saintly biography. But standing inside them, you notice how private and unsettling they often are. A vision is not a reward. It's an interruption. You sit beside a saint jolted awake in the middle of the night. Heart racing, unsure whether what just happened came from God or from a mind pushed too far by fasting and prayer. The famous version will later sound confident and symbolic. The quieter truth slips in. Confusion comes first. Fear, too. Historians still debate how saints themselves distinguished divine visions from imagination, especially in a world without language for psychology. A strange and lesser-known fact drifts through softly. Many visions occurred during illness, exhaustion, or prolonged sleeplessness. Fevered dreams blurred into theology. Sensory deprivation sharpened inner imagery until it felt external. This doesn't make the visions meaningless, but it does make them human. Historians still argue whether acknowledging these conditions weakens or deepens our understanding of holiness. You notice how reluctant many saints are to share what they've seen. Visions invite suspicion. Boasting is dangerous. One saint confides only after years of silence. Pressured by superiors who insist the experience must be written down. Another records a vision reluctantly, apologizing repeatedly for the inconvenience of it. Sanctity, once again, is deeply awkward. There's humor here, too, woven gently into the night. One saint misinterprets a symbolic vision so thoroughly that it leads to a small theological mess requiring correction. Another receives a dramatic heavenly message, and immediately forgets part of it. Divine communication, it turns out, does not come with automatic note-taking skills. As you drift further, the boundary between waking and sleeping thins. Candlelight flickers like breathing. Chanting slows into something almost indistinguishable from silence. You realize these visions didn't always clarify faith, they complicated it. They raised questions no one felt qualified to answer. Some saints worry they're being deceived. Others worry they're not worthy. Doubt coils tightly around even the most luminous experiences. Historians still debate how much of this doubt was edited out later to preserve authority. Standing here, it feels inseparable from the vision itself. Your own thoughts soften now. Images blur at the edges. The saint's nights stretch long and quiet, filled with half-seen light and unanswered questions. And as you float onward, just above sleep, The visions fade, not resolved. Not dismissed, simply set aside. Waiting patiently for morning that may or may not bring clarity. You wake without fully waking. The way monks did when bells rang before dawn. Pulled from sleep not by urgency, but by habit. The world around you is structured now. Not loud, not grand, just arranged. This is where holiness learns to keep time. Rules appear, not as chains, but as scaffolding, holding a life upright long enough for meaning to settle in. Historically, this is the rise of monastic rule, most famously associated with Benedict of Nursia. You already know the headline, Ora et labora, pray and work. A rhythm so influential it shapes Western Christianity for centuries. What's less often emphasized is how practical it all is. These rules aren't mystical manifestos. They're survival guides for groups of humans trying not to drive each other insane in close quarters. You walk through a monastery at dawn. Sandals scrape stone. Someone coughs. Someone else regrets yesterday's dinner. Prayer begins, not because inspiration strikes, but because it's scheduled. That's the revelation here. Holiness by routine. You don't wait to feel spiritual. You show up anyway. Historians still debate whether this structure nurtured faith or merely disciplined behavior. But standing here, it feels like both at once. A strange, lesser-known fact drifts quietly through the cloister. Early monastic rules include detailed instructions about sleep positions, eating speed, and even laughter. Too much laughter is suspicious. Too little might be worse. Saints, apparently, were expected to regulate joy like a controlled substance. Historians still argue whether these restrictions reflected spiritual ideals or simple anxiety about chaos. You notice how ordinary everything feels. Kitchens smell of boiled vegetables. Fields need tending. Someone spills water and apologizes too much. Sanctity here isn't dramatic, it's repetitive. And repetition, you realize, is deeply calming, like white noise for the soul. There's humor tucked into the margins. One rule insists monks should sleep clothed, just in case prayer breaks out unexpectedly. Another warns against private property so strongly that monks aren't even supposed to claim ownership of a pen. Good luck enforcing that. Even saints, it turns out, like their favorite writing tools. As the day unfolds, prayer and labor blur together. Hands move automatically. Words repeat until meaning dissolves and reforms. You feel your breathing sync with the rhythm. This isn't ecstasy. It's steadiness. And for many saints, steadiness is the miracle. You sense why this structure mattered. After persecution, after deserts, after visions and relics, people needed something sustainable, a faith that could survive boredom. Rules provided that, not excitement, but endurance. Historians still debate whether institutional holiness diluted radical faith or preserved it. Standing here, the argument feels less urgent than the silence. Evening comes gently. Lamps are lit. Voices soften. The rule carries you toward rest without asking how you feel about it. And as your thoughts slow, you realize something quietly reassuring. Holiness here doesn't require brilliance, just presence, just returning, again and again, to the same simple acts, until sleep finally arrives and takes you with it. You start noticing the little things now, the habits no one thought worth polishing for posterity. Not the sermons or the prayers, but the odd routines that formed when people lived the same way for years. Convinced that repetition itself might sand the soul smooth. This is where saints become strange. Historically, hagiographies tend to gloss over quirks unless they can be framed as virtue. But the record still leaks. One of the well-known themes is extreme asceticism, fasting, vigils, self-denial. The lesser-known reality is how personalized these practices were. Saints didn't follow a single template. They improvised, sometimes badly. You pass a monk who eats the same meal every day. Not out of symbolism, but because change feels distracting. Another refuses to sleep lying down. Convinced comfort dulls alertness. A famous saint sleeps sitting upright for decades. Which sounds impressive until you imagine the neck pain. Historians still debate whether such habits reflected spiritual discipline or simple stubbornness elevated into holiness. A strange, lesser-known fact drifts in quietly. Some saints developed ritualized behaviors that look remarkably like modern compulsions. Counting prayers repeatedly, washing hands far more than necessary, repeating actions until they felt right. These habits were often praised as devotion. Historians still argue how differently we might read them today. You sense how the community responds. Some habits inspire imitation, others are tolerated with polite confusion. One saint becomes known for his kindness to animals, feeding birds from his own ration. Another refuses to kill insects, choosing instead to gently escort them outside, an act of mercy that is extremely inconvenient in a medieval dormitory. Humor slips in softly. A saint famous for silence is also infamous for extremely loud sneezing. Another who preaches simplicity becomes oddly particular about how his cloak is folded. Sanctity does not erase personality, it intensifies it. As the day unfolds, you realize these habits aren't random. They're attempts at control in an uncontrollable world. Illness, famine, violence, death. Saints respond by shaping tiny corners of their lives with absolute precision. If you can't command history, you can at least decide how you eat bread. Night returns, gently. Candles burn low. The odd habits fade into shadows, leaving behind a sense of effort, imperfect, human, repetitive. You feel your own thoughts slowing, aligning with the quiet regularity of these lives. The strangeness no longer feels unsettling. It feels familiar. And as you drift onward, the saint's peculiar routines hum softly in the background, like a lullaby composed of small, stubborn acts of order, carrying you deeper into the night. You begin to feel the weight of it now, not in your hands, but in the air. Power has entered the room. Quietly, without asking permission, the saints notice it too. They always do. This is where piety brushes up against politics, and neither comes away untouched. Historically, this moment is unmistakable. Christianity is no longer hiding in corners or whispering in borrowed rooms. Bishops advise emperors. Saints correspond with rulers. The famous event everyone remembers is Constantine's conversion and the subsequent legalization of Christianity. Faith steps into the light. What's less often lingered on is how uncomfortable that light feels to those who never asked for it. You walk beside a saint summoned to court. The floors are polished. The air smells different, less dust, more authority. Someone bows. Someone waits too long to speak. This saint would rather be anywhere else. A strange, lesser-known fact drifts in. Many saints delayed or avoided meetings with political leaders for as long as possible. Aware that proximity to power came with expectations. Historians still debate whether such avoidance was humility or quiet resistance. You watch letters being written, careful, balanced, full of phrases that sound supportive without promising obedience. Saints advise kings on mercy, justice, restraint. Sometimes they're listened to, sometimes they're politely ignored. One well-known example surfaces. Ambrose of Milan confronting Emperor Theodosius after a massacre. The story is famous for its moral clarity. The quieter detail is how rare such confrontations actually were. Most saints negotiated rather than challenged outright. Historians still argue how often moral authority truly restrained political violence. There's tension everywhere. Power wants legitimacy. Holiness wants distance. The two circle each other like cautious animals. Some saints accept influence, believing it can soften cruelty. Others retreat, convinced it will corrode intention. Neither path offers safety. Humor slips in, gently. One saint delivers a sermon intended to rebuke corruption, only to realize halfway through that half the audience is responsible for it. Another becomes famous for blunt honesty, earning both admiration and an impressive collection of enemies. Sanctity, it turns out, does not come with diplomatic immunity. You sense the strain on these figures. They're expected to be moral compasses. Yet they're navigating storms of ambition, fear, and bureaucracy. Decisions made in prayer echo into laws, taxes, wars. The stakes are higher now. Holiness is no longer just personal. It's institutional. As night settles, the halls grow quiet. Power sleeps fitfully. Saints pray uneasily. You feel the rhythm slow again. Breath deepening. The story doesn't resolve the tension. It never really does. Faith and authority remain entwined, for better or worse. And as you drift onward, the echoes of whispered counsel and unspoken regret fade softly behind you, carrying you toward the more intimate struggles waiting ahead, where doubt, not politics, presses closest to the heart. You notice the animals before the people do. A bird lands close, unafraid. A dog lingers at the edge of a gathering, tail low but hopeful. The world feels briefly less hierarchical here, as if the usual rules about who listens to whom have been gently misplaced. This is where saints and animals cross paths, and the stories soften in tone without losing their strangeness. Historically, these accounts are well known. Francis of Assisi preaching to birds, Jerome with his lion, Cuthbert sharing fish with otters. They become beloved images, repeated endlessly, but standing inside them, you realize how practical some of these relationships are. Monasteries exist close to land and weather. Animals aren't symbols first, they're neighbors. You watch Francis speak, voice calm, hands open. The famous version emphasizes harmony. The quieter detail slips in. The birds don't suddenly become tame pets. They listen, then fly off, because they are birds. Historians still debate how literally these scenes were meant to be taken, and whether medieval listeners even cared about literalness the way we do. A strange, lesser-known fact drifts in gently. Some saints developed reputations as protectors of animals precisely because they refused to exploit them during famines or hardship. This was controversial. Mercy toward animals could look like irresponsibility toward people. Historians still argue whether these choices were radical compassion or impractical idealism. You sense the theological undercurrent. If creation is good, then animals matter, not as metaphors, but as fellow participants in existence. This unsettles hierarchies. It makes holiness feel less vertical, more horizontal, less about control, more about attention. There's humor here, soft and warm. One saint scolds birds for being too loud during prayer. Another negotiates with a wolf, which sounds inspiring until you imagine the conversation logistics. Sanctity does not guarantee effective animal training. As evening comes, you feel a calm spread. These stories aren't about dominion. They're about relationship. Saints listen as much as they speak. Animals respond without theology, without pretense. There's something deeply restful about that. Your breathing slows. The animals settle. The saints do too. And as you drift onward, the line between human and creature blurs just enough to feel comforting, carrying you gently toward the inner landscapes where belief meets doubt, and certainty loosens its grip. You expect certainty by now. After miracles, rules, power, and harmony with animals, doubt feels like it should have been dealt with already, filed away, resolved, neatly labeled, but instead, it moves closer, quieter, more intimate. This is where doubt lives inside holiness. Not as a failure, but as a companion that refuses to leave. Historically, this is less visible, but deeply present. Saints are remembered for conviction, not hesitation. And yet, when you stand close enough to their words, letters never meant for public display, prayers scribbled in margins, you hear it. Questioning, weariness, a sense that faith, rather than being a constant flame, flickers and dims without warning. You sit beside a saint in prayer, waiting for reassurance that does not arrive. The famous story might emphasize lifelong devotion. The quieter truth is that many saints experienced prolonged periods of spiritual dryness, what later writers would call the dark night of the soul. A strange, lesser-known fact drifts in. Some saints believed doubt itself was a form of humility, a refusal to pretend certainty they did not feel. Historians still debate whether these doubts were central experiences or later theological reframings meant to normalize struggle. You notice how lonely doubt is here. There's no language yet for emotional support. No concept of spiritual counseling as we'd recognize it. Saints often interpret doubt as personal weakness, not a shared human condition. They pray harder, fast longer, and sometimes, nothing changes. There's a famous figure who writes passionately about faith, and a lesser-known passage where he admits feeling abandoned by God. That line doesn't make it into sermons very often. It's uncomfortable. It suggests holiness doesn't insulate you from silence. Historians still argue how many such admissions were edited, softened, or buried to protect idealized narratives. You feel the emotional weight of this section. Doubt doesn't shout. It whispers questions at inconvenient moments. During prayer, during routine, during moments that are supposed to feel meaningful. And yet, saints keep going, not because they're sure, but because they've decided to stay. Humor slips in softly, because it always does. One saint complains that his prayers feel like talking into an empty room, then immediately apologizes for complaining. Another worries his doubt might offend heaven, as if the divine were easily annoyed. Sanctity, it seems, does not cure overthinking. As night deepens, doubt becomes less sharp. It settles into something gentler, a companionable uncertainty. You feel your own thoughts slowing, the pressure to resolve everything easing. The saints don't solve doubt. They live with it, they carry it quietly, like a stone in a pocket. And as you drift onward, breathing deeper now, you realize this may be the most human holiness yet, not confidence carved in stone, but persistence in the dark, walking forward even when the path fades into shadow. You notice the shift not because anything dramatic happens, but because expectation starts pressing in from all sides. People arrive carrying hope like fragile glass. This is where healing takes center stage, not as spectacle, but as need. The air feels heavier with it, thick with the quiet desperation of bodies that ache, fail, and don't always cooperate. Historically, healing miracles are among the most famous saintly acts. The blind see, the lame walk, fevers break. These stories spread fast. Because pain listens carefully, you recognize the pattern immediately. What's less often mentioned is how inconsistent healing appears when you're standing close enough to watch it unfold. You wait with a crowd. Someone is cured, someone else isn't. The famous version will remember the first person. The quieter detail slips in. The second person goes home anyway. Helped by friends, still hurting, still faithful. Historians still debate how early communities understood unanswered prayers, whether they framed them as tests, mysteries, or simply realities too uncomfortable to emphasize. A strange, lesser-known fact drifts gently through. Some saints explicitly warned people not to expect healing every time. This was not a popular message. Hope prefers certainty. But these saints understood something painfully practical. That promising cures you cannot guarantee turns faith into a transaction. Historians still argue whether such caution was pastoral wisdom or quiet damage control. You watch a saint lay hands on the sick, face lined with exhaustion. Healing here is not effortless. It drains, it costs, and sometimes, it fails. Saints are remembered for miracles, but they live with limitations. Sanctity does not override biology nearly as often as stories imply. There's humor, soft and human. One saint becomes known for curing headaches, only to complain frequently of his own. Another heals a man's leg but spends the evening nursing a terrible cough. Holiness, it seems, has a deeply ironic sense of balance. As night settles, the crowds thin, the healed rejoice, the unhealed rest. Both are part of the story. Even if history prefers one, you feel the pace slowing again, your own breath evening out. Healing doesn't resolve everything. It flickers, present, absent, unpredictable. And as you drift onward, the expectation fades into acceptance. Bodies remain fragile. Hope remains necessary. The saints walk on, carrying both cure and limitation with them, moving quietly toward lives that will soon be remembered not for perfection, but for persistence. You don't notice the mistakes at first, because history has a way of smoothing them out, sanding down rough edges until everything looks intentional. But if you walk slowly enough, they appear, small missteps, sharp regrets, decisions that linger like an echo long after the moment has passed. This is where saints make mistakes, and where holiness proves it never meant perfection. Historically, this is uncomfortable ground. Saints are canonized for virtue, not error. And yet, when you look closely, you find arguments, impatience, misjudgments, and moments that clearly didn't go according to any divine plan. One well-known example drifts by. A saint whose temper became almost as famous as his piety. Remembered for powerful sermons and equally powerful outbursts. The official stories praise his repentance. The quieter truth is that the damage still happened. Historians still debate how much was forgiven in life versus excused later. You walk beside a saint who gives advice that turns out to be wrong. Not morally wrong, just ineffective. Someone follows it, and things get worse. The saint carries that weight quietly, revising future counsel with care. This part rarely makes it into devotional texts. Sanctity, it turns out, does not come with infallible judgment. A strange, lesser-known fact settles in gently. Some saints were later criticized by other saints. Letters survive that are surprisingly blunt. Disagreements about doctrine, practice, and behavior surface, reminding you that holiness did not produce consensus. Historians still argue whether these conflicts strengthened the tradition or fractured it in subtle ways. There's humor here, subdued but real. One saint becomes famous for strict discipline, only to be gently mocked by peers for being unnecessarily harsh. Another preaches humility while secretly struggling with pride, something he recognizes only after being publicly embarrassed. Sanctity, it seems, has a cruel but effective teaching style. You sense the emotional texture of these moments. Regret doesn't shout, it sits quietly, replaying scenes at inconvenient hours. Saints confess, they apologize. Sometimes they simply live with the consequences. Forgiveness exists here, but so does memory. As night deepens, the mistakes soften into lessons, not tidy morals, but lived experience. You feel your breathing slow, your thoughts loosening their grip. These saints are not models of flawlessness. They're examples of return after error, return after misjudgment, return after disappointment. And as you drift onward, the weight of perfection lifts slightly. Holiness feels less like a pedestal and more like a path, uneven, forgiving, and still open, leading you gently toward the quiet final chapters waiting ahead. You sense the ending before it arrives. Not dramatically, no trumpets, no final speeches, but in the way the air grows softer. The way conversations shorten, the way bodies slow down without asking permission. This is where death enters the lives of saints. Not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a presence to be met. Sometimes calmly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with unfinished sentences still hanging in the room. Historically, the deaths of saints are some of the most carefully remembered moments. Peaceful passings, last words, final blessings, these scenes become templates for holy dying. What's less often emphasized is how varied these deaths actually were. Some saints died serenely, surrounded by prayer. Others died in pain, confusion, or ordinary illness, with no visible sign that anything extraordinary was happening at all. You sit beside a saint whose breathing grows shallow. The famous version will later describe light filling the room. The quieter detail slips in. Someone is worried about practical matters. Who will take care of the poor tomorrow? Where the keys are kept? Whether the fire was put out? Historians still debate how much of the peaceful imagery was added later to comfort the living rather than describe the moment accurately. A strange, lesser-known fact drifts gently through. Many saints feared death, even while believing deeply in what came after. Faith did not erase instinct. Bodies resist ending. This wasn't seen as failure, but as humanity. Historians still argue how openly this fear was expressed versus quietly endured. You notice how rarely death is tidy. A saint tries to give a final instruction and forgets the ending. Another asks for water, then apologizes for the trouble. Sanctity does not override physical decline. If anything, it makes the small indignities more visible. There's humor here too. Surprisingly, one saint famously schedules his own deathbed vigil with excessive precision, only to outlive everyone's expectations. Another insists on dying alone, only to be discovered mid-transition by a very startled monk. Even at the edge of death, life refuses to follow scripts. As night settles, candles are lit again, voices soften, someone begins a prayer and loses their place. You feel your own breath slowing in response, syncing with the quiet rhythm of endings. Death here is not triumphant. It's intimate. And as you drift onward, the saints slip gently from presence into memory, leaving behind silence, not empty, but full of lives lived imperfectly, faithfully, humanly. The path ahead grows quieter still, carrying you toward the long echo of what happens after holiness leaves the room. You don't notice the moment when a person becomes a story. It happens gradually, like dusk settling in without asking permission. Voices soften, details blur. What remains is shape, outline, meaning. This is where saints begin to slip from memory into legend. Not because anyone intends to exaggerate, but because remembering is never a neutral act. Historically, this transformation is inevitable. Communities retell lives they loved. Stories are repeated, then refined. Edges are smoothed, contradictions quietly resolved. One well-known process unfolds here. Oral tradition giving way to written hagiography. Lives once remembered by friends are now recorded by admirers. The shift changes tone. Reverence replaces familiarity. You watch a group gathered years after a saint's death, sharing stories by lamplight. One person remembers kindness, another remembers severity, a third doesn't remember the saint at all, only what they've been told. A strange, lesser-known fact drifts in. Early saintly biographies were often written decades, sometimes centuries, after the saint had lived. Historians still debate how much of what survives reflects lived reality versus communal longing. You feel the tension between truth and usefulness. Stories that inspire endure. Stories that confuse quietly fade. A saint's temper becomes righteous zeal. Their doubt becomes testing. Their mistakes are reframed as necessary trials. This isn't deception so much as adaptation. Communities need models more than complexity. There's humor tucked into this process. One saint becomes famous for a miracle that likely belonged to someone else entirely. Another is credited with deeds that happened generations later. Medieval authors, it seems, were not overly concerned with footnotes. Historians still argue whether this blending diluted authenticity or preserved spiritual meaning. You notice how legends grow not upward, but outward. Saints acquire symbols, keys, animals, objects, visual shorthand for crowded memories. Over time, the symbol becomes easier to recognize than the person ever was. Holiness becomes iconic. As night deepens, the human details fade further. The saint no longer coughs, no longer hesitates, no longer makes awkward jokes. What remains is essence, carefully shaped, deeply loved. You feel both loss and comfort in that. Your breathing slows. The stories settle. Saints now walk not beside you, but slightly ahead, luminous with accumulated meaning. And as you drift onward, you realize legend is not the opposite of truth. It's what happens when truth is held for too long by many hands, warming and reshaping it as it's passed gently through time. You feel the machinery start to hum before you ever see it. Not loudly, nothing so crude, but with the quiet confidence of a system that believes it knows what it's doing. This is where holiness meets paperwork, where reverence learns to stand in line, and where saints, long after death, become subjects of review. Historically, this is the process of canonization, though in its early forms it looks nothing like the polished procedures you might imagine. The well-known reality is that the Church eventually formalizes sainthood, creating criteria, investigations, and approvals. What's less often remembered is how informal it all began. At first, saints were declared by popularity. If enough people believed you were holy, you were. It was democracy, but with candles. You stand in a city where crowds venerate someone locally revered. Prayers are offered, stories circulate, relics appear, sometimes suspiciously fast. Authority notices. Bishops debate. Is this devotion genuine, excessive, politically useful? A strange, lesser-known fact drifts in. Many early canonizations were effectively ratifications of what people were already doing. Control followed belief, not the other way around. Historians still debate whether this was pastoral sensitivity or institutional opportunism. You watch as questions are asked. Were miracles real? Was doctrine sound? Were there any inconvenient behaviors? Witnesses speak. Memories are tested. The saint, now silent, cannot clarify anything. Holiness becomes something others must defend. It's an odd reversal. A life once lived in private now dissected in public. Politics seeps in gently, like ink spreading through paper. Some causes advance faster than others. Geography matters. Influence matters. Timing matters. A saint from a powerful region finds support more easily than one from the margins. Historians still argue how often sanctity alone determined outcomes, versus alignment with broader church interests. There's quiet humor here. If you listen carefully, one candidate's cause stalls for centuries because the paperwork is lost. Another advances rapidly because the miracles are well documented and extremely convenient. Sanctity, it seems, benefits from good record-keeping. You sense the tension in the room. The church wants saints, but safe ones. Predictable ones. Lives that reinforce structure rather than challenge it too sharply. The wild edges you've walked beside, doubt, mistakes, resistance, are gently trimmed. Not erased, just softened. As night settles, the process grinds on. Decisions are delayed. Files are closed. Others are opened. You feel your breathing slow. The administrative rhythm oddly soothing in its own way. Even holiness, it seems, eventually learns to move at bureaucratic speed. And as you drift onward, the sound of debate fades into quiet approval stamps and murmured prayers, carrying you gently toward the final reflections, where the question is no longer how saints were made, but why they still matter at all. You feel the distance collapse here. Not time exactly, but relevance. The saints no longer stand behind you in history, they sit beside you. Quietly, in the same dim room where you're listening now. The world has changed, dramatically, irreversibly, and yet their presence hasn't entirely faded. This is where the question finally surfaces. Gently but persistently. Why do saints still matter? Historically, the answer seems obvious. Saints shape calendars, holidays, cities, and names. They fill art galleries and quiet chapels. They're woven into culture so thoroughly that even people who don't believe in them still live among their echoes. That's the well-known reality. The quieter truth is more subtle. Saints endure not because they were extraordinary, but because they were recognizable. You think back over the lives you've walked through. Fear, doubt, routine, mistakes, politics, exhaustion. None of it feels distant. Saints mattered to earlier generations because they made faith survivable. They translated vast, abstract belief into lives that still included bad sleep, awkward conversations, and days that didn't feel meaningful at all. Historians still debate whether saints shaped belief or simply reflected what communities already needed. But the relationship feels circular, almost mutual. A strange, lesser-known fact drifts in softly. Many modern devotions to saints focus less on miracles and more on companionship. People speak to saints not as heroes, but as listeners, intercessors, quiet presences. This shift isn't accidental. In an age saturated with noise, saints offer something rare: attention without urgency. You notice how saints are repurposed over time. Once symbols of resistance, they become symbols of comfort. Once radical, now familiar. This isn't dilution so much as adaptation. Saints survive because they're flexible. They don't demand you live like them. They simply sit with you while you don't. There's humor here too, understated but real. Saints once feared for their lives. Now they're printed on keychains. Saints who fled attention now headline festivals. History has a sense of irony that borders on affectionate. Sanctity, it seems, learns to laugh eventually. As night deepens, the saints feel less like models and more like witnesses. They watched their world change. Now they watch yours. Not judging, just present. You feel your breathing slow. Your thoughts untangle. The question of relevance no longer needs an answer. Presence is enough. And as you drift onward, the room grows quieter still. Only one stretch remains: the soft return to yourself. To this moment, where the stories loosen their hold and let you rest. You don't feel a clear ending approaching. There's no signal, no closing door. Instead, everything simply grows softer, as if the world has decided to speak more quietly out of courtesy. The saints are no longer walking beside you now. They've slowed, stepped back, dissolved gently into the background, not gone. Just no longer insisting on being seen. Historically, there is no final chapter for the lives of saints. Their stories don't conclude so much as disperse. Devotion thins. Practices change. Some names remain bright, others fade into footnotes. Then into silence. That's the well-known arc. The quieter truth is that forgetting is not failure. It's part of how meaning settles instead of shouting. You feel the echoes rather than the figures. The desert silence, the routine of bells, the tension of doubt, the weight of bones wrapped in cloth. All of it hums faintly. Like memory after a long day, present, but no longer demanding attention. A strange, lesser-known fact drifts through. Many early Christian communities fully expected saints to be temporary guides, not permanent fixtures. Historians still debate whether sainthood was ever meant to last beyond immediate need. You return, gradually, to the present, to your room, to your breathing. The saints do not ask you to believe anything specific now. They don't request imitation. They don't even require admiration. They simply leave behind a mood, a sense that life can be carried gently, even when it's heavy. There's a final, almost imperceptible humor here. After centuries of miracles, debates, and devotion, the saints end up doing something very ordinary, keeping you company until you fall asleep. Sanctity reduced to background comfort. Honestly, they might appreciate that. The pace slows further. Sentences stretch. Images blur. You no longer need to follow anything. The stories loosen their grip, like hands releasing something they trust won't fall. Your breathing evens out. The room dims behind closed eyes. The saints recede fully now. Not into darkness, but into rest, where stories no longer need to be remembered clearly to matter. You are safe. You are allowed to stop thinking. The past has finished speaking for tonight. Let the silence settle. Let the weight of the day slide away. Nothing more is required of you now. End of script. Sweet dreams.